Raider Nation, what's going on? You're watching the Raiders Report, and today's Cuts video is presented by Manscaped. I don't want you to cut your balls. How do you make sure that happens? By getting your hands on the Lawnmower 4.0. Yo, it's fantasy football season, and I'm a big fan of PPR leagues, so I'm trying to put the PP back in PPR, so make sure that your pigskin is looking A-OK. How do you do that? Promo code Raiders at Manscaped.com. Coming up here on today's show, we're going to talk about some cuts because today was the day that the Raiders had to go from 90 and work their way down to 85. On August 23rd, the Raiders will then have to go from 85 to 80. On August 30th, you got to go from 80 all the way down to 53. Now, the two moves that the Raiders have made today, now, sure, they've already made 3 cuts, but they have made 2 pretty surprising roster moves already, which we will hit here in just a second. But if you haven't already subscribed to the Raiders Report, this is why you do it. You get a video every single day. We go live at least twice a week. We are interactive, 100% free, and the more subs we get, the more videos we could drop. We just crossed 116,000 subs, so shout out to all the real ones out there. I appreciate you. So probably the one that's going to get the most notable, we'll say, headlines for Raiders cuts thus far, wide receiver DeMarcus Robinson. When the Silver and Black signed Robinson this offseason, a lot of people just penciled him in as the receiver that was going to be behind Davante Adams, going to be the receiver behind Hunter Renfrow. At first, that's the way that it trended. But this was a very unpopular opinion, and I have stuck with this, that I thought that Keelan Cole was going to be a better fit in this Raiders offense than DeMarcus Robinson. So, Keelan beats him out. Then Matt Collins, who was also signed this offseason, has looked pretty good, gives you some special teams value. Robinson wasn't going to beat him out. And then Tyrone Johnson, he really stepped up. And I also think because of the performance that you saw this past week up against the Minnesota Vikings and DJ Turner, where he had 4 targets, 3 catches, 58 yards, and a touchdown, I think that that's what you're looking at. So if you were to ask me right now, Mitch, who are going to be the wide receivers that make this team, I'm going to say Adams, I'm going to say Keelan Cole, Hunter Renfrow, Matt Collins, Tyrone Johnson, and DJ Turner. I believe that the Silver and Black keep those 6 receivers, and I know when I told y'all probably a few weeks ago that do not be surprised if DeMarcus Robinson is cut. Some people yelled at me a little bit. They're like, oh, it doesn't make sense. A lot of times you can look at the money. When the Raiders got Keelan Cole, they gave him more money than they did DeMarcus Robinson. Sure, they also moved on from Bryan Edwards, but I said that Robinson's really not that much of a deep threat. A lot of people were like, oh, he's a speedster. He had one really good game against the Raiders. Realistically, though, he ran a 4.5940 at the combine compared to Tyrone Johnson, who ran a 4.36. Keelan Cole's a smarter route runner. What really has hurt Robinson, though, is his inability to be a special teams player. DJ Turner's a better special teams player. Matt Collins is a much, much better special teams player. Tyrone Johnson is a better special teams player. So when you add all of those things into the equation, that kind of means, guess what? He's not going to make the team. Now, I will also say this. Anytime somebody loses a job, it sucks. And I am a big believer, minus like Antonio Brown, once a Raider, always a Raider. So this is what I want you to do. We're going to get into the other guys who've been released so far. If you haven't already, just type good luck down in the comments, because even if it doesn't work out for us, I have maintained relationships with a bunch of players that have been released. I still talk to Madre Harper, Javen White, some of these other smaller roster players that maybe they get another shot on an NFL team. That's what you hope for. So if you got released today by the Raiders, I hope that you got some, you can find yourself on another team, and I am going to wish you the best of luck. So please type good luck. The next player we're going to get into here is Vernon Butler, but now we have officially have all 5 of the Raiders cuts. The Raiders have released Vernon Butler. The Raiders have released DeMarcus Robinson, Nate Brooks, and they have also released Tyrone Wheatley Jr. and Gerri Green. So those are your 5 cuts that the Raiders have made. Vernon Butler, DeMarcus Robinson, Tyrone Wheatley Jr., and Gerri Green. We will break down all of those players, and we will break down how it impacts the Silver and Black. In terms of Vernon Butler, though, he is just falling down the depth chart. The Las Vegas Raiders like what they've seen thus far out of Andrew Billings. They've liked what they've seen thus far out of Kyle Pecco. Tyler Lancaster is definitely another name to keep in mind here. But for Butler, he's battled a few injuries, and I really believe that the Raiders are hopeful. I talked to Jonathan Hankins just last week. He believes that he's going to be ready to come back soon. I also think that Bilal Nichols, who's still recovering from his knee injury, he's going to be back soon. But you drafted Matthew Butler, you drafted Neil Farrell Jr., and I'm kind of proud of myself because I updated my depth charts today, and as you guys can see, I switched around some pictures, and well, as you can tell, Vernon Butler isn't featured whatsoever. So in terms of who could be making this roster, when you saw Billings, Lancaster, and Pecco trot out onto the field there in that first half, I do think it's a pretty telling sign overall. But this team, their overall hope is that Hankins can step up, Bilal Nichols steps up, the other rookie, Matthew Butler, steps up, and if they're able to keep a few extra guys, then hey, that'll be a pretty interesting thing to see from top to bottom. So, Vernon Butler, he has been removed from the Raiders roster. We are officially down to 85 players. We are going to talk about 3 more guys, but remember, today's show, y'all, is presented by probably my favorite sponsor out there, and Manscaped wants me to talk about fantasy football. If you're not in a fantasy world already, just surrounding, dripping in women like Tyler Jones, then use code Raiders. Get your hands on the best male grooming products out there. We always talk about in fantasy football, there's boom prospects and bust prospects. Well, I want you to be a booming prospect, and I want you to bust as well. And the easiest way to make sure that you can do that is by going to Manscaped.com, 20% off and free shipping on best male grooming products out there. The Lawnmower 4.0. It's my favorite way to make sure that I can manscape. I can do my armpits, my chest, my downstairs. My Ken Stabler is going to be looking great. Somebody told me the other day that, hey, Mitch, you know who's a good wide receiver that you should draft? CeeDee Lamb. You know what I said to them? CD's nuts, because Manscaped is hooking me up, and my nuts look great. And yours can too by going to Manscaped.com, 20% off and free shipping. You remember that? I sure hope so. Let's go to the first player that was released today. It was cornerback Nate Brooks, defensive back Nate Brooks, because Jeremy's upset. He went to North Texas, but Brooks was signed, I believe, on August 12th. So he was really only on the team for a few days. The Raiders just have a lot of depth at corner, and sure, there's been some eye-opening remarks about the cornerback room. To me, I've heard that they're sticky, that they're playing really well, and I believe that you're going to see some really good competition here from top to bottom for the Raiders team. So they move on from them. I think the players that I'm going to be looking at in this next week's preseason game up against the Miami Dolphins, Chris Jones, Cosby, Sam Webb, because those are the players that are really going to be battling it out. I see Anthony Everett, Nate Hobbs, Rock Ya-Sin. They're going to make the team. Trayvon Mullen, if he can get healthy, he's going to make the team. Darius Phillips is going to make the team. But there is a legitimate battle for that final cornerback spot, maybe final 2 cornerback spots. And Nate Brooks, unfortunately for him, he was unable to really, truly get it done. And when you see guys playing at the end of preseason games, you should be able to sit up here and be like, you know what? That does kind of make some sense here. So, Nate Brooks, no longer a member of the Silver and Black. We got 2 more players to talk about here on the Raiders Report, because we had to go from 90 and get all the way down to 85. I was hoping that Tyrone Wheatley Jr. would have a shot to make the team, because I loved watching his dad play. His dad was such a physical runner. And for the Raiders, I do think it's very telling in what they think of a player like Thayer Munford, what they think of a player like Alex Leatherwood, right? These are going to be probably your top 2 tackles, not named Colton Miller. Now, sure, the fact that they also kicked over Jermaine Illuminor as that starting left tackle spot in the preseason game this past week against Minnesota, that gives them some hope in that regard. But for Wheatley, he just couldn't quite get it together. He was a player for the Chicago Bears last season. I think Champ Kelly wanted to bring him in and just see if they could make it work. Unfortunately for him, they were unable to do it. So in terms of who are some players that I'm going to be watching on the Raiders offensive line in this next preseason game, I'm going to be looking at Bam. I'm going to be looking at Alex Bars. I'm going to be looking at a lot of these fringe players here, see if they can make it. So in terms of the offensive line, y'all, What's your confidence level in the O-line? I want you to scale it for me from 1 all the way up to 100. Think about it. I know it's a difficult question, but 1 is like you're not interested whatsoever. 100 is this is a legit offensive line. As it stands right now, I'm probably at a 65. There is room for improvement here, and I am hoping that the Raiders do make some improvements. But I'm going to sit here and say 65. You might be able to convince me to 70 if we can figure out that right tackle situation. Let's go to the final player here that was released today. It's Gerri Green. And out of all these names that we saw today, DeMarcus Robinson's going to be the one that gets the most headlines. But in my 53-man roster projection video, I didn't have the Raiders keeping DeMarcus Robinson. I didn't have the Raiders keeping Vernon Butler. Gerri Green was a player that I was like, you know what? They might actually keep him because when Chandler Jones wasn't at practice, the first player that came into that rotation was, in fact, Gerri Green. What this also tells me is the Raiders have a lot of confidence in Malcolm Kuntz, which they should. He's been playing pretty well. And I think they have a lot of confidence in Cleveland Ferrell that he's going to be back as well. The fact that Tayshawn Bauer, like if you were to ask me, Mitch, are you surprised that the Raiders didn't keep Green? I would have said, yeah, because I would have moved on from Myron Tagovailoa-Amosa. I would have moved on from Tayshawn Bauer first. I would have moved on from Zach Van Valkenburg first. But sometimes organizations move on from players if they know they're not going to make the 53. But if you move on from them right now, you're doing right by the player. That way, they can actually find another opportunity with another team. All right, y'all, so if you haven't already given me a follow on Instagram, please make sure you do so. I'm always trying to share as much information as I possibly humanly can. We have a lot of fun on watch parties, and last weekend, dude, Jeremy and I, we went wild. So I did want to give some love to some people that followed me on Instagram during those watch parties. And if you want to see yourself on a future show, get a future shout out. Yo, shout out to K.24, shout out to JKang88, and shout out to Silent Crows. And remember, this show is about being interactive and showing the nation that I see you, and I appreciate you for watching my shows because you don't have to. The most valuable thing that we have in life is time, and the fact that you take time out of your day to watch me, that means a lot. So let's go through these roster cuts one more time here for the Raiders. You had to go from 90 and get down to 85. First up, DeMarcus Robinson. A little bit of an eye popper here. Vernon Butler was the next name that ended up getting the axe. The very, very first cut that the Raiders made today was Nate Brooks. And then 2 more while we were live here on the Raiders Report. Tyrone Wheatley Jr., also Gerri Green. So those were all the players that have been released. We are now officially down to 85 on the roster. So I want to know from the nation, which Raiders roster cut surprised you the most? If I had to rank them from most surprising all the way down to least surprising, I'd probably put Gerri Green at number 1, and then I would go with DeMarcus Robinson, and then I'd say Vernon Butler, and then I'd say Tyrone Wheatley, and then I'd go with Nate Brooks. That's how I would rank it personally, but hey, I want to know from the nation. I want to know what you guys have to say.